Welcome students. Alright, so this is an extra class from my behalf, something that I was supposed to upload. I thought that I would upload this long time back, but I couldn't. So, one of your fellow students, one of your friends had asked me a question. So this lecture will answer that specific question as well, and it will be intricately linked to whatever else I would be saying in this essay, because since I had mentioned this earlier as well, that since we are dealing with philosophy over here, we cannot discuss about one topic and leave out the rest, because they are all rationally build up upon each other. So it's a causal effect, the causal progress of philosophy, and more Sartre's. We are reading Sartre's philosophy after all. So we will then discuss about some important portions of the important concepts that Sartre introduces in his essay. I will be sharing a couple of materials with you, and also mentioning a few names of some articles that you will be easily that will be easily accessible to you on JSTOR with a free account, so you can just read from there, and I will be mentioning you the names of the articles as well as sharing a particular link with you, so and a few documents with you as well, so that will aid in your understanding. In this video I will be discussing about the essentialism, the silence which Sartre talks about, the subjectivity, the objectivity which he talks about, and the reconciliation of both of them which he talks about, the being which he talks about, his philosophy in general, and his philosophy as particularly manifested in what is literature, and then more specifically in the particular essay Why Write. So let's begin with that thought. Alright. To answer the question which one of you had asked about the subject or the artist becoming inessential in relation to his work, to answer that directly and quite coarsely, however, in the entire duration of the video you will be finding various additions to the same answer. However, to put it very simply, literature resists any particular universal recipe for all humanity, right? It is not that there is not one kind of literature that we can say is for everybody. So literature does not provide it does not provide you with one singular homogeneous recipe that will be universally applicable to all of humanity. So it resists this homogenization. It resists any particular universal recipe for all of humanity. And in doing so, it avoids what we have been calling becoming essential, that literature avoids essentialization. It avoids essentialization, or that there is no essence of literature, in that it is always in the intersection. It is always in the literature is always in the intersection of history. It is always in the intersections of science, history, science, philosophy, religion, law, society. All of these things, they are all inseparable from one another. We cannot say that history is inseparable, is completely exists in isolation from science, philosophy, religion, law, society. So we can say the similar thing for each and every of this component. And literature is at the intersection of all of these things. All of these they exist through and by literature, all sorts of literature. So, and many other discourses as well, many other meta narratives, or the petite narratives, many other discourses as well apart from these. And to give a very good example, apart from all of these, if we consider another specific sphere of discourse, that is Marxism, for Marxists, according to Marxists, literature is forever bound in a historical situation. Literature is a propaganda. It can be propagandized according to Marxists. It can be made instrumental in revolutions, in rebellions, in social changes, in anthropological changes, in situations of the working class, of the bourgeois, of the capitalist. Literature can be used for and by all of these aspects that a Marxist considers to be the pillars of a society. So according to Marxists, literature is forever bound within a historical situation, and it is ideological. Literature is ideological, literature is temporal. So that is temporal, it is bound up in time, that is bound up in time and space. It is specific to a specific era, specific to a specific generation. So it is bound up within a historical situation always, and it is always ideological, and it is always temporal. So there are all of these aspects of literature, that means which pushes us to conclude that, which makes us correctly conclude that literature resists homogenization. It does not provide any universal law with which humanity can abide by. So therefore, it avoids essentialization, that is, the creator of literature cannot create any essential art. It is both the subject becomes essential and then inessential, while the object, that is the art, it becomes inessential and then essential. They are all relational to each other. That is how a particular work of art appeals to you, how it exists for you. Where do you find yourself in it, or whether or not, if you ever find yourself in it, whether that work of art surpasses your own existence. In this play, there is hidden the essentials and the inessential. If a piece of art if a work of art is essential to you, if you essentialize a work of art, then you become inessential in context to that work of art. But when you do not do that, then you become essential, whereas the work of art becomes inessential. So it is not a choice. It is not that I can say that today I will choose to be inessential and let literature or my painting or a work of art be essential. That is not the case. It is a process. It is a process whereby we will see in this video. It is a process whereby we will be asked, particularly by Sartre, that we should lose ourselves, that it is the subjects, we, the human beings with small b's, that is the human beings, we must lose ourselves in order to reach at perfect reconciliation, in order to call the perfect being, the authentic being, the authentic man. It is important for the subject to lose itself completely, and the work of art will provide you with means to do that. It is not an end. You are not reaching for that perfect work of art in which you will lose yourself. No, the work of art is a means which you use in order to lose yourself. সো এখানে কিন্তু আর কি কোনো বোকা আর কি ট্যাঞ্জিবল এক্সাম্পলস চাইলে হবে না। ওকে, we will be finding examples in literature, textual evidences, philosophical evidences, but there is no concrete materialistic evidence which I can give you that how to lose yourself. It is the drive of human beings to perfect themselves, to which Sartre is appealing to. He's saying that in order, we need to let go of our egos, of our prejudices, of our stereotypes, of our cliches, of our culture boundedness, of our pride oppressive history. Now remember, he's writing after the World War, so we all know he is an existential philosopher, but he's also a humanist. And this is what he sees, this is what he visualizes for the entire humanity, is that in order to be the authentic man, an authentic man upon which the authentic man, the being with a capital B, or the Dasein of Heidegger, the Dasein is an ideal, authentic man, the embodiment, not of perfection perhaps, but the embodiment of perfect reconciliation of all opposites, of the self, of the other, of that which we are, of that which we are not, which we like and which we dislike, the male and the female, the masculine and the feminine, the inside and the outside, all of the fundamental opposites are reconciled on the body of the same, of the same, of the being with a capital B. And Sartre appeals to us that in order to reach for that, in order to call that the same, that authentic man, we, with our limited subjectivities, with our limited visions, with our limited egos and pride and arrogances, and facticities, that transcendence, we must transcend this state and call forth that being. And literature, what is literature? Etarই একটা exploration. That why is there literature at all? This is the purpose that he attaches to literature, that literature is the means which will allow us to do that. It is a hope, it is a vision of a philosopher. Roland Barthes. So Roland Barthes, moving on with that thought in our mind, Roland Barthes in his essay, The Death of the Author, we all know about this famous essay. In this essay, he writes, I will quote it, just a minute. So he writes, the writer's only power is to combine the different kinds of writing, to oppose some by others, so as never to sustain himself by just one of them. If he wants to express himself, at least he should know that the internal thing he claims to translate is itself only a ready-made dictionary. So this thing is nothing but the Platonic ideal, the ready-made dictionary from which we are translating and producing in this world. So, simply put, according to Barthes, the writer is only an imitator. The writer is only an imitator. But according to Sartre, the writer is more than that. He is more than a mere imitator. The writer is responsible, as we have seen in the essay, the writer is responsible for his or her freedom of writing, which he or she must grant to the reader as well. Something that Sartre has discussed vigorously in his essay. The essay Why Write is essentially about this, the relationship of the writer and the reader, the intersubjectivity. Both are subjects, both have their subjectivities, subjective positions, subjective perspectives. Sartre writes about the intersubjectivity of these two components. So, the writer is responsible for his or her own freedom of writing, with which he or she must grant to the reader as well. This freedom disallows, that is, does not allow literature to have any preset purpose, which would force and constrained the writer to be a mere imitator, to be a mere propagandist for dominant ideologies. The writer thus for Sartre is a creative force. That is what he means when he talks about the creative force. The writer for Sartre is thus a creative force and has substantial autonomy in choosing the course of action, and the writer who is the creative force assumes that literature is anti-totalitarian. It resists homogenization, it resists any form of totalitarianism, a form which suppresses differences. So literature resists this, and literature is anti-totalitarian. The writer assumes this. That is, the task of the writer will never be predetermined by the set standards imposed upon him from outside, either from academic establishments or political ideologies. This itself is the very opposite of essentializing literature or any work of art. But for Sartre, the writing comes foremost, and that is the most important to him. So that is why we will always be talking about, when we talk about literature, we mean writing. So writing is the very opposite, or literature is the very opposite of this is the very opposite of essentializing literature. In a book called, just a moment, in a book called The End of History and The Last Man, it was written in 1992 by Francis Fukuyama. So in this book, Francis Fukuyama writes that in the 20th century, I will quote it on screen. Just a moment. That it is safe to say that is the 20th century, that in the 20th century, Fukuyama writes, it is safe to say, has made all of us into deep historical pessimists. So remember the history of 20th century. Remember the advent of modern existentialism. Remember the causes of Beckett. Remember Pinter. Remember Sartre. All of these people. So Eliot as well. So he says that it is safe to say in the 20th century, it has all made all of us into deep historical pessimists. Therefore, Sartre contends, he opines that the writer is above all an agent of freedom. He or she must not only be responsible for what he or she writes about, but also how that writing will affect the society and how it will affect the reader's liberation. The writer is responsible for the readers, for the fate of the society and other individuals, as well as for himself or herself. Moreover, if writers are to become agents of liberation, if it is the writer's task to remind readers of their freedom, to what extent it is possible in this century? That is where all of these discussions come on. To what extent is it possible for the writer to maintain this freedom, to gift this freedom to the readers as well in this century, in a century which caused 2 wars, which saw various political movements coming into the forefront, dictatorship, totalitarian regimes, bloodshed, dehumanization of communities of people all over the world. That is what Sartre wants to explore. Why write? For whom to write? For whom should I write? What is it that we should write about? What is literature? This is what his book is about. In another book called Prisms, Cultural Criticism and Society, it was written in 1993 by Theodore Adorno. Look at what he says. He says that to write poetry after Auschwitz, Auschwitz কি? You all should know. It was the large concentration camp maintained by the Nazi German forces. So to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Moreover, this corrodes even the knowledge of why it has become impossible to write poetry today. So Adorno's point against poetry over here is saying that it corrodes the knowledge, that is the situation, the circumstances, the context in which they are living, the times in which they are living, the times, the space, the idea, the politics, the society in which they are living. The truth of all of these would be corroded if they were to be expressed in poetry. What does this mean? We should also remember that the 20th century also saw the rise of Stalin and extensive totalitarianism in Russia. Marxists contended that the concept of freedom and literature as an agent of liberation also means humans' freedom is not inherent, but conditioned by material and social circumstances. Marxists would say that the liberation does not exist in isolation. Freedom and literature as an agent of liberation of humans also means that the freedom is not inherent, but they are conditioned by the material and social circumstances. What sort of a freedom do you want? What do you want to do with your freedom? What do you want your literature to do, to serve? They are all determined by the social forces located in the temporal spatial factors. Therefore, Sartre formulated the concept of the commitment of the writer. And he says, and I will quote something on the screen. This is written by a couple of other scholars. I will share their essay with you. Very important. It's very easily written and it will help you a lot in understanding the role of the writer in the essay, or what Sartre means by the committed writer. So they write that any writer is inevitably committed in that he or she cannot soar above the sky. Soar above the history. The commitment of the writer indicates her very purpose of writing, and there is no way a writer, whether literary or non-literary, that could escape the ideological implication of his or her work. That is basically what Marxists are saying, Adorno are saying. And Sartre hoped that literature and the act of writing in particular could serve as an impetus, as a boost, as a push for political and social freedom in the face of the deplorable condition of post-war Europe. So the commitment of the writer, it indicates the very purpose of writing, which for Sartre was to push for political and social freedoms in the face of the oppression that people of the post-war Europe were facing, were being subject to. But why is writing more significant, important, urgent, more so than painting, more so than the other art of painting, sculpting, or even poetry? Why so? Why writing? This is because in all of these other forms of art, that is paintings, sculpting, and poetry even, in all of these the artist presents images and objects which the reader or the viewer is free to relate to the external world of objects according to his or her own perspectives. Correct? You, while viewing a painting, you cannot determine the purpose behind the choice of colors. The blue of the sky was melancholic to Wordsworth. The blue of the sky can be a symbol of hope in Sleepless in Seattle. So all of these various perspectives come into consideration in these arts, because the artists in these cases, they present images and objects with which we try to relate ourselves to the external world of objects and images. Relate যখনই বললাম তখনই perspectives come into the equation, subjectivities come into the equation. So they are, poetry more than others, inherently anti-totalitarian. That is, the fact that they appeal to the subjectivities of the readers and the viewers, they are inherently, implicitly anti-totalitarian. Moreover, the choice of a certain color or combination of colors or words or phrases, with conceited meanings, that is, conceits or metaphors, they can never be derived objectively by the reader or the viewer, as that choice resides purely and only with the painter and the poet. Right? Why does Eliot include or choose to use the works of Wagner as a meta-narrative in his The Wasteland instead of Mozart? We will never have this question because it is a choice that resides in the mind of Eliot, and Eliot is dead. So we will never be able to determine that because it resides purely and only with the artist. We can never deal with that objectively. We can only deal with all of these things subjectively. আমরা ব্যক্তিগতভাবে এদের সাথে ডিল করতে পারবো. What it feels to me. What is Wagner to me? So I will imagine the purpose behind it. That is my imagination. I will never know why, in essence, Eliot chose Wagner and not Mozart. We will never know that. So the urgency demanded in the face of reform and changing social conditions that was the material context of that time. The urgency of these changing social conditions, it led Sartre to denounce poetry in particular and to look for an antidote that immediately proves efficient and does not only engage with the men and women of the letters, but also with the ordinary citizens. He chooses prose, and he says, and I will quote from the book, just a moment. He says, elsewhere in the book, in What is Literature, prose is in a sense utilitarian. I would readily define the prose writer as a person who makes use of words. The writer is a speaker. He designates, demonstrates, orders, refuses, interpolates, begs, insults, persuades, insinuates. Sartre has a way with words, we all know that. If he does so without any effect, he does not therefore become a poet. He is a writer who is talking and saying nothing. It often happens that we find ourselves possessing a certain idea that someone has taught us by means of words without being able to recall a single one of the words which have transmitted it to us. So unlike poetry, prose utilizes language to express more concrete ideas. Language becomes a means to an end. The words and sentences no longer matter as long as they tell us something. It is not a poem in which every word matters and words are etched to the reader's mind. On the contrary, the reader of prose does not focus on each individual words. Unlike a poem in which every word matters. So the reader of the prose does not focus on each individual words. The prose is like an instrument one grabs when he or she is in danger. He or she grasps it. As soon as the danger is past, he or she does not remember whether it was a hammer or a stick. So what you utilize it for, it depends upon the situation itself. That is quite a dynamic purpose for prose. It does not see any fixed definitive purpose. It is different to and for different people, and it is also different for the same person, because that same reader forgets the old purpose of that prose once that purpose has been served. For a next crisis, for a next conflict, that same piece of prose may be used in a different fashion, in a different manner. For example, former slave writers of prose, they would write then in order to express their trauma, in order to express their oppression, in order to express their dehumanized conditions in the face of generational torture, in the face of cumulative tyranny and injustice. After that phase has passed, that those same pieces of prose writings will exist as a document, as a manifestos, as evidential proofs to the past traumatic experiences of those people who may or may no longer exist now. That is what I am trying to say. That is what Sartre is trying to say. That as soon as the danger is past, he or she does not remember whether it was a hammer or a stick. The writer makes use of words for a particular purpose. Dickens wrote prose to condemn Victorian society, or Saint Augustine to organize Christian doctrines. In Sartre's view, the prose is a disclosure of intention, an intention made explicit by words and sentences. It goes without saying that these intentions cannot be impartial. Intentions, they are always biased, they are always partial, they are purposive. Therefore, the prose writer has a purpose, therefore the prose writer is a committed writer. And as Sartre puts it, man is the being towards whom no being can be impartial, not even God. No being, no man can be impartial to another man. When we are talking about the entire humanity, each and every human being is inclined towards another human being because of for some purpose, for some index, as a scale, as a support, as whatever purpose a human being may serve in another's life. So that is why he says man is the being towards whom no being can be impartial, not even God. And the history of religion, they will also prove similarly. He puts the writer of prose above the poet. Now, I will provide you with a material that will expand upon these topics, and I have highlighted certain portions and also written some comments on them. So remember to keep an eye on them while you are viewing the document on an Adobe Acrobat reader. So in that way you will be able to see my comments and whatever I have extra information that I have provided within the document. So moving on, he puts the writer above the poet, like I said. But Sartre also brings into the equation the role of the reader. The writer's purpose, the answer to the why of why write, cannot be whole without the reader. To Sartre, literature is an experience. All right. Literature is an experience. Where reading establishes the ideal balance between subjectivity and objectivity. Reading establishes a perfect balance between subjectivity and objectivity. Reading is both the process of disclosure. These are the terms that Sartre uses in his essay. Reading is both the process of disclosure, like we observe trees, the sky, and find that nature is beautiful, but we also find that it is outside of us, and we are inessential to nature. We are not a composite part of nature. We are not constitutive of nature that is external to us. So we are inessential to nature. And reading discloses this. Like nature is external to us, what we are reading is also external to us. So while reading, while walking, while taking a stroll in nature, in between a forest perhaps, we realize that we are inessential to it. Correct? So when we are reading, while we are reading, we realize that we are inessential to what we are reading. We are inessential to that writing, to that work of art. Reading is also a process of creation. Because for the author who reads his or her own writing, the author who reads his or her own writing, a work of art can never be completely objective for the author. For the author, what he creates, when the author reads his or her own piece of writing, his or her work of art can never be completely objective. Since nature exists in the external, something that we have already established, the author can disclose it only according to his or her own subjective position. That is how he or she views, observes, and perceives the external entity that is nature. Reading, I said, is a process of disclosure. It is also a process of creation. When the reader reads, the nature of this work of art is external to the reader. External to the reader. Therefore, the reader is inessential to both nature and also what he or she is reading. When the writer reads his own work of art, his or her own work of art, he knows that what he has written is about the external nature, something that is outside of him. Therefore, what he has written is only his subjective perspective of the nature, how he or she has personally viewed, observed, and thought, and reflected and understood nature. So, for the author who reads his or her own work, a work of art can never be objective, because what he has written from a subjective point of view, because about what he has written, that is nature perhaps. Nature exists externally from him, it exists outside of him. The artist faces his or her own intentions and knowledge through his or her own subjective perspective. Reading himself, herself, does not create any new novel experience. Therefore, Sartre says that there is no art except for and by others. I hope this is clear. And this in a sense brings us to the concept of silence, a very important concept of his essay. He says, he writes in Why Write, you can just find out the page number later on, I'll just quote. He writes, thus, the author, in order to address himself to the freedom of readers, and he requires it in order to make his work exist. But he does not stop there. He also requires that they return this confidence which he has given them, that they recognize his creative freedom, and that they in turn solicit it by a symmetrical and inverse appeal. Here there appears the other dialectical paradox of reading. The more we experience our freedom, the more we recognize that of the other. The more he demands of us, the more we demand of him. This is what I just explained right before. You can just rewind the video again and hear again, and it will be all clear. I am quite sure of that. So moving on with this concept of silence, we are about to analyze this concept now. So it's all linked, of course. So you are to read this article. I am writing this on the screen. The rest I will write actually. All of the articles I will be writing on the screen. You can find it all on JSTOR. So the first one being Sartre's silence, the limits of recognition in Why Write, by Nikolai Lubecker. So you can find it on JSTOR. I will mention the name of the other essay as well. This is a critical, an appreciation of the essay. So this is the name. I'm sorry. This is the name, The Relevance of Sartre's Case Seneca Literature, or the relevance of Sartre's What is Literature. So this is an appreciation of the entire book, in which all of his concepts and ideas will be spoken about and appreciated, and basically you will learn the importance of the book, which is, you know, in intricately connected with the essay. The essay is right in between, right in the middle of the book, so we cannot understand the essay without paying attention to the book. And I will be quoting from the entirety of the book throughout this video as well. So just go through this essay, find it on JSTOR. It's available for free. You can open an account and read it online. It's a small essay, not a very big one. However, the one that I am teaching you from now is the one that is the bigger essay. So I have taken the liberty to quote from this essay. You can also read it by yourself, of course. So Martin Lubecker, in this article, he writes that Sartre famously defines the literary work as an appeal to the reader, right? The reader is called upon to realize the work. Reading is not simply a question of understanding the writer's message, but involves an active participation in the creation of the work. True, this is something that Sartre is saying. We have read it together. The work of art then and thus becomes a task to be discharged. And this task is of an ethical character. It is true that Sartre does not claim that it is our duty to read, no, but he argues that if you pick up a book, remember that sentence, if you pick up a book, you have to engage in the creative process. That intersubjectivity-তে খেলাটা করতেই হবে যদি তুমি বইটা খোলো। On the other hand, the literary work should also meet the reader with quote-unquote politeness. He says this somewhere else in the book. The author must not try to impose his views, political, moral, or other, on the reader. The author is making an appeal to the freedom of the writer. This is what he means by freedom of the reader. Appeal to the freedom of the reader. The author is making an appeal to the freedom of the reader. So, the author is making an appeal to the freedom of the reader, and the reader is agreeing to use this freedom to create the work. In this process of objectification, that is, the reader being appealed to use his or her own freedom and to participate in the work of art. I have already said that the reader can only read objectively, right? The reader, I cannot know the intention behind Sartre's choice of words. I cannot know the purpose of Sartre's writing. I can only interpret it according to my own subjective stance. So I am reading in my subjective stance, but my act of reading is objective. I perceive the book as an object outside of myself, about which I do not have any knowledge, but with which I am about to perceive the greater world per se. So the reader is agreeing to use his freedom to create the work of art. In this process of objectification, the reader comes to realize his own freedom. And he now demands, the reader demands of the author that this will make further appeals to his freedom. Reading becomes, thus it becomes an act of generosity. This is what he means, Sartre means by reading is an act of generosity. And Sartre sums up the process in an idyllic passage. I'll just read the passage. Thus, the author writes in order to address himself to the freedom of the readers and he requires it in order to make his work exist. But he does not stop there. He also requires that they return this confidence which he has given them, that they recognize his creative freedom, and they in turn solicit it by a symmetrical and inverse appeal. Here, there appears the other dialectical paradox of reading. The more we experience our freedom, the more we recognize that of the other. The more he demands of us, the more we demand of him. So this recognition that he talks about, this reaching of this mutual recognition where the reader and the writer, they recognize each other's freedom and they demand more of it from each other. The reaching of this mutual recognition is very significant in order to harmonize the object and the subject, in order to harmonize objectivity and subjectivity, that is, the oppositional forces, in order to reconcile the oppositional forces. The calling of the Dasein with which I began this lecture, if you remember. So the reaching of this mutual recognition is the crucial step in order to harmonize both the object and the subject regarding a work of art. But what does it imply politically? What does it imply to reach this mutual recognition politically? What is the purpose of it? Committed writing মানে তো political writing এর কথাই আর কি বলা হচ্ছে. What does it mean? Sartre argues that the literary experience, that literature is an experience, so that experience shall offer a model of democracy. Not only that, he believed that literature can actively participate in all democratic institutions as well. So, offer a model for democracy in which the opposites are reconciled. The objects and the subjects exist in perfect harmony. Not only this, literature can actively participate, he says, in democratic institutions as well. That is, not only can it be an ideal with which we are to index, to gauge and scale, with which we are to assess our democratic relations, but it is also a motor or a mover in act in a democratic society. It is a means and it is also an end. Sartre does not tell us how to do so, or he does not outline the specifics of what an author should write about, but that committed literature should first allow the mutual recognition of the writer and the reader and their freedoms to take place. This is a very ambivalent stance. It is not conclusive, and there is actually no conclusion. Sartre does not come to a valid conclusion of this. We will see there are certain ambiguities in all of this, that he will go on to say that this is not possible in today's state. A mutual recognition of the object and the subject and of their freedoms, it is not really possible in the state of things in which we are living. Yet it is an endeavor he takes, it is a task that he takes to be discharged. He is writing, right? He is also writing, so it is a meta narrative. He is writing about writing, he is writing about reading. This mutual recognition, Nikolai Lubecker says, is utopic and non-realizable. So Sartre writes in the very next chapter, "For whom does one write?" I will quote it on screen. This is what he writes in "For whom does one write?" He says, "Thus, in a society without classes, without dictatorship, without stability, literature would end by becoming conscious of itself. Literature would become purposeless. It would understand that form and content, public and subject, are identical. That is, the harmonization is complete. That the formal freedom of saying and the material freedom of doing complete each other, and that one should be used to demand the other. That it best manifests the subjectivity of the person when it translates more deeply collective needs, and reciprocally that it that its function is to express the concrete universal to the concrete universal, and that its end is to appeal to the freedom of men so that they may realize and maintain the reign of human freedom. To be sure, this is utopian. It is possible to conceive this society, but we have no practical means at our disposal of realizing it. And this is again takes us back to that futile endeavor of humanity to reconcile the being in itself with the being for itself, to reconcile the subject and the object, to reconcile the internal and the external, the self and the other. The concept of silence, it comes as the root of this futile endeavor to reconcile the opposites, that is, to reconcile the being in itself with the being for itself. And the concept of silence comes at the root of this inquiry, of this futile endeavor of humanity, of this ontological question. Ontological, that is the origin of being. The concept of silence comes at the root of this ontological inquiry into the futile endeavor of humanity, which is an influence, a very important concept again. So I'll write it on the screen, just a moment. Which is an influence of the Hegelian thought, that is a thought propounded by Hegel, a Hegelian thought of Aufhebung. So there is a accent on U. The Hegelian thought of Aufhebung, or when a new idea, a novel idea which emerges out of a resolution after a conflict, for example after the French Revolution, for example after the Napoleonic Wars, for example after the Marxist Revolution. So when a new idea which emerges out of a resolution or a conflict, it both preserves and transcends the oppositional ideals which had caused the conflict in the first place. So there were two oppositional ideas. There were the royalists and there were the commoners, the public. The commoners overthrew the royalists' French Revolution. The proletariat would, in a visionary circumstance, the proletariat will overthrow the capitalist. The oppositional ideals, they clash. And the resolution, the conclusion, the result is a new order of things, a novel idea. And this new idea, this new order of thing, it preserves as well as transcends both of the oppositional ideas. This entity, this preservation of the oppositional ideals, and yet transcending the hindrances, transcending the obstructions caused by the opposites. Both of these together, they are embodied in this Aufhebung. So the concept of silence is the root of this Aufhebung, that is the endeavor to reconcile the being for itself with the being in itself. So now let us talk a bit more about this irreconcilable differences or opposites that he talks about. Sartre has suggested that reading offers a synthesis between perception and creation. As we already said, disclosure and creation, reading is both of it. It is a disclosure creation. When reading a book, the reader will both disclose and create, and it will become disclosure creation. Reading becomes disclosure creation. What is the meaning of this? It is an active process. The reader must be attentive. If he or she is tired or absent-minded, it becomes impossible to create the meaning that lies beyond the specific words and sentences. According to Sartre, this indicates that meaning is never given in language, something he mentions in the essay. meanings results from a process of totalization, right? A work of synthesizing. Like I've already mentioned, Sartre has already mentioned that unlike poetry, in a prose we do not pay attention to each and every single letter and word. It is a synthetic meaning that comes across to us, the holistic meaning of it all. And it is therefore situated beyond the actual textual manifestation, beyond the words, beyond the language of presentation itself. This level, beyond the words and sentences, is Sartre calls by various names. He calls them themes, subject, meaning. He also calls them the literary object, the organic totality of words, synthetic form, opponent of the word, etc., etc. And he says, and I will quote from the essay again. He says that thus, from the very beginning, the meaning is no longer contained in the words. Since it is he, on the contrary, who allows the signification of each of them to be understood, and the literary object, though realized through language, is never given in language. This is what he means, what I just said, this is what he means by this quotation, this passage that I am quoting. On the contrary, it is by nature a silence and an opponent of the word. A very simplistic reading of this passage might argue that in order to grasp the meaning of a text, we have to move between its material level, whether this be sound or graphic image. We have to move between its material level and the idea. To some extent, we have to forget the signifiers in order to grasp the signified. We have to look at the bigger picture. However, Sartre continues, the idea of silence appears less semiotic, that is less in relation to language, and more ontological, that is more in relation to the origin of being, to the understanding of the origin of being. Like I said, that silence is at the root of the ontological inquiry of reconciling the being in itself with the for itself, the subject and the object, the differences. Not by homogenizing them, but by the offibum, that is by retaining the differences yet transcending them. A very complicated and a very difficult endeavor, which is almost futile. So Sartre says, again I will quote from the essay, just a moment. He says that for if the silence about which I am speaking is really the goal at which the author is aiming, he has at least never been familiar with it. His silence is subjective and anterior to language, that is before language, before he chose to write. His silence comes before. It is the absence of words, the undifferentiated and lived silence of inspiration, which the word will then particularize, whereas the silence produced by the reader is an object. So the silence of the writer is the silence of inspiration, which words give shape to, and the silence of the reader is an object. And at the very interior of this object, there are more silences which the author does not tell. It is a question of silences which are so particular that they could not retain any meaning outside of the object, within which the reading causes to appear. So it is only the reading, the act of reading, which causes the silences to appear. That is why for the reader, the silence comes after he reads, and for the writer, the silence comes before he writes. However, it is these which give its density and its particular face. To say that they are unexpressed is hardly the word, for they are precisely the inexpressible. This is a complicated passage. In the first two sentences, Sartre makes a distinction between silence of the author and that of the reader. The silence of the reader is the literary object. The prose that is in front of you. The object is the result of the projections that the reader makes from the basis of the words that he or she reads, he or she comes across on a page. As Sartre says in one of the following paragraphs, each word is a path of transcendence. This allows the reader to engage with the text and ultimately compose the objective silence, the silence of the object. Therefore, the silence of the reader comes after the words. The silence of the author precedes them. Sartre writes about inspirational silence, a silence dismantled word by word in the production of a text. The silence is dismantled, it's reduced, it's minimalized as the writer continues to write. If we first have an inspirational silence, in this literary communication between the reader and the writer, we first have this inspirational silence. This silence gradually disappears with the words, with the advent of words, and these words will then allow the reader to produce a silence that is described within the object, that is within the writing itself. It is important to note that to some extent the literary work escapes the author in this process. The author will be aiming for the objective silence located at the end of the literary process, that is the end of the communication with the reader. But he will never have known this silence, right? The writer never comes face to face with the objective silence which only the reader can give birth to. We may therefore say that the author is trying to offer something he does not know. The second part of what you can see on the screen, the second part of this same quotation, it complicates the matter even further. We are now at the receiving side of the literary communication, of the literary process, at the side of the reader. We are concerned with the objective silence of the reader. This objective silence, Sartre says, is itself filled with more silences. These silences have been introduced by the author and they are his intentions. So, just a moment. The silence that the reader encounters upon or after the act of reading, which is also indicative of the freedom of the reader. This silence has been introduced by the writer or the author. They are his intentions. However, these intentions are defined as inexpressible over in this quotation. He uses one kind of silence to create another kind of silence. But outside the production of the literary object, the inexpressible remains elusive to the reader. So if you never pick the book up, you will never be able to grasp at this silence. You will never be able to grasp that inspirational silence which the author has chosen to dismantle, to deconstruct with the use of words by writing. An indicative of the author's freedom. Summing up then, the literary experience appears as a most singular exchange. The author aims to give something which he does not entirely know, and the reader receives something to which he has only limited access, something he cannot fully articulate. We may wonder that if this is the same, we may wonder now, Sartre has been quite contradictory in other of his works. In the same work, he would later on say that the role of the author is to call a spade a spade. He also says that I distrust the incommunicable. It is the source of all violence. So Sartre is very contradictory and ambivalent in nature, as I have mentioned again and again. And this ambiguous stance is a homology, as it reflects the ambivalence, the ambiguous reconciliation of the oppositional forces of the universe. So the writing of Sartre reflects the purpose of his writing as well. And what is the implication behind Sartre's passages that concern silence? What does he imply by all of these descriptions and all of these pronouncements upon silence? What is implied is liberty, freedom. Liberty is at stake over here. Are we free when we read a book? Are we free when we transcend the words and sentences on the page? Or are we just trying to recover what the author has put into the book? Sartre will maintain that yes, we are truly free. We are not just following a path the writer has laid out for us, and we are not just enjoying a pseudo liberty of inventing everything ourselves. Silence is the key component of this argument. It serves to guarantee the freedom of both the reader and the writer. In Why Write, the essay, the double engagement with the unknowable, that the fact that the author gives something that he does not know. So the double engagement with this unknowable and the inexpressible, that is, the reader receiving something which he or she cannot discern quite right, quite immediately. It allows literature to become an exercise in freedom, right, with infinite possibilities. Even if, therefore, silence cannot be seen as an inessential part of the argument. It is very much significant. It is very much essential, even if there are only a few places where Sartre talks about them. Sartre's purpose of writing the book, What is Literature? It shows heavy influence of Mallarmé, Stephen Mallarmé, who posited similar questions like Sartre does in his preface to his book. I'm mentioning this because I'm about to quote a very beautiful portion of Mallarmé's book. I have translated it very loosely, so please, I apologize for any mistranslation, but you will get the idea. So Mallarmé also asks, if there is grounds for writing, do we know what it means to write? In truth, what is literature? Quote, Mallarmé also analyzes the role of silence and whiteness of a paper in the reading process. Look at what he writes. He writes in his book, The Mystery in the Letters, that read this practice to press according to the page, to the blank which inaugurates its ingenuity to oneself, even oblivious of the title, which would speak too loudly, and when aligned itself in a break, the least disseminated chance conquered word by word. Unfailingly the white returns, just now free, certain now, to conclude that nothing beyond and authenticate the silence. To conclude that there is nothing beyond and nothing authenticate than silence. So the silence, the blank inaugurates the ingenuity. Not even the title which speaks too loudly. The white returns free, certain, to conclude that there is nothing beyond and there is nothing authenticate be itself. There is more authenticate than itself. Malarm describes reading as an activity going from white to white. Just like Sartre describes reading as an activity going from silence to silence, the inspirational silence of the writer to the objective silence of the reader. The reader first looks at the blank sheet and then his eyes settle on the title. This title should then be forgotten because it speaks too loudly. From there, the reader will work his way through the text. Gradually, he will discover the relations between the elements in the text. He will overcome chance and thereby move towards a whiteness no longer unfounded but certain, confirmed. This overcoming of chance is not a spiritual journey towards an absolute truth. At the end of the text, the reader concludes that nothing lies beyond silence. And silence is the only authentic thing. There is no religious transcendence. You can only transcend yourself, the self of the writer, the self of the reader. The reader has found his place in relation to silence and is now ready, as Malarm writes elsewhere, to perceive of himself simple, infinitely on earth. And though they are very different authors, their descriptions of reading process, they resemble each other. For both of them, reading is an activity. Sartre considers literature as an activity in which the subject can establish a harmonious relation to the world. Malarm, with his ideas of doing away with religious beliefs, moves in the same direction. So, how does Sartre reach a conclusion with the unattainable of Ibon? How does he reach the conclusion with the irreconcilable oppositional forces? So in Why Write, Sartre writes that the dream of strict harmony between subjectivity and objectivity may be broken, but we can learn to live in tune with ourselves. If we learn to live in solidarity with ourselves, we may learn to live in solidarity with others. So there is no reconciliation absolutely necessary. What is necessary is that we learn to live with ourselves. And when we learn to live with ourselves, when we recognize our own authenticity, we may learn to live in solidarity with others. In this way, that futile endeavor, it turns into a relative success. It is relatively transformed into a success by a moral conversion. So how does this conversion come about? First, the subject realizes that it is fundamentally gratuitous. That is, what he has been given freely by nature. He has unearned it. He has not earned that externality of nature that exists. So first the subject or the writer realizes that he is fundamentally gratuitous. So when I talk about the subject, I am synonymously talking about the writer, because in the relationship between the writer and the reader, all of the oppositional forces of the world are reconciled. Between all of the subjects, between all of the objects, between all of those superior selves and those inferior others. So the writer and the subject and the object and the reader, they should be read in parallelity when we try to consider Why Write as a solution to the post-war problems according to Sartre. So first the subject realizes that it is fundamentally gratuitous, then it takes upon itself passionately to live this contingency, this dangerous position in which he is, this contingency wherein he is not sure about what to do about this unearned inspiration, this nature which has been given to him freely. Because contingency is precisely the precondition for freedom. In the moral conversion which I just spoke about, right now, in the moral conversion, the subject thus comes to understand that because it is unfounded, because it is gratuitous, it is also free to invent itself. True, that is completely true. If you have been given freely, then you will also understand, you will also come to terms with your freedom to reinvent yourself freely. By fully engaging in this process of unveiling and creation which Sartre talks about in the essay, it comes to terms with its inescapable gratuitousness, which is inescapable unfoundedness. Precisely for this reason, the artist, as a producer of meaning, represents the archetypal man, the typical man, in these pages of moral conversions. And the task of inventing yourself will not eliminate your existential anxiety altogether. That you have been thrusted upon the world. You have been given the world freely. You are gratuitous. It does not mean that and it also means that you are free to reinvent yourself, to make yourself. But it does not mean that your existential anxiety is gone altogether. But the unhappy consciousness becomes relatively happy. It's quite a practical statement. So these subject-oriented aspects of Sartre's systems, they are tied to that primary ontological argument. The happiness of authentic living, like that authentic man, not only comes from converting this gratuitousness into freedom, but also from being in contact with the being. Being in contact with the being. How is this link between the gratuitousness of the subject and the sudden appearance of being established? Sartre will say that embracing the gratuitousness is a way of giving oneself over to being. It is a way of losing yourself to that being, to this being. And thereby you calling upon it to appear. Calling upon that authentic man, that authentic human being, the same, to appear. And in this pivotal, very important passage of man's capacity to manifest, to call upon being, this is where the theme of silence appears. Sartre argues elsewhere Sartre argues that silence, I'm quoting, silence is the appeal of being to man. Quote close. Again quote, it is an appeal to draw being from its perpetual collapse into the absolute indistinctness of night. Night for Heidegger, Heidegger's being, Heidegger's the same. Night for Heidegger is pure being. So it's not a negative connotation. Only if we answer to this appeal can we live authentically. So when the writer is appealing to you, the reader, only if you answer to this appeal can you live authentically. Can you open yourself up to the infinite possibilities that the author's silence allows you. The inessentialization of literature will allow precisely this. To sum up, in order to attain, just a moment. In order to attain this authenticity, or in order to attain jouissance, this is a concept we will not be talking about now. I'm very sorry for that. So this is synonymous to living authentically, very simplistically put. So in order to attain this jouissance that comes from living authentically, man must answer silence by losing himself and thereby bring this being into the world. In Why Right, Sartre asks us to consider, thus he asks us to consider the literary experience as a two-sided phenomenon, His main interests lie with the interplay between the author and the reader via the literary work. He first of all presents literature at the level of intersubjective communication, but he also suggests a less communicative aspect of the literary experience, and that is of silence, which complicates this relationship. This theme of silence suggests that to some extent intersubjectivity and communication depends on elements which we cannot fully understand. The relation of these two literary experience, they are not explicitly spoken about in Why Right. Nevertheless, the structure of Sartre's argument suggests that the intersubjective communication follows on from that beginning of that ontological inquiry. Without silence, there would be no freedom in relation between reader and writer. The reading would be no different from taking orders. In other words, we are not communicating in spite of the inexpressible, but on the basis of the inexpressible. The silences are the most important things. The inexpressible is a resource. It guarantees freedom. It ensures that there is something to write about. And with that, I would like to end this lecture. I hope that I have addressed the specific query which I was asked to clear out. So I will be posting this video. You will get this. It will be night, but you can. I will be posting it tomorrow morning. I will upload it tonight, but you will get access to it by tomorrow morning by 10 a.m. tomorrow, so you can go through it in your own time at your own convenience. And I will also send you some materials that will help you in answering questions from Sartre and appreciation. I will send you the essay which talks about what is a role of a committed writer, and also a few other supporting materials. Thank you very much.